The Harry Potter story is notorious for dark wizards, ancient magic, and thousand-year-old secrets. During the millennia before Harry ever set foot in Hogwarts, from the creation of the first Horcrux in ancient Greece to the rise and fall of Grindelwald, all the way to the night Voldemort destroyed himself in Godric's Hollow, the wizarding world had already been shaped, broken, and rebuilt more times than most wizards care to remember. We'll be covering it all in chronological order. 1. Herpo the Foul creates the first Horcrux, ancient Greece. Most people associate Horcruxes with Voldemort, and fair enough, he made 7 of them, which is frankly obscene. But Voldemort didn't invent the Horcrux. That honor, if you can call it that, goes to a dark wizard named Herpo the Foul, an ancient Greek practitioner of the darkest magic recorded in wizarding history. Herpo walked the earth somewhere between 1050 BC and 600 AD. We don't have a precise date, which tells you something about how deep into history we're going here. What we do know is that he was the first person to successfully fracture his own soul and store a piece of it in an external object. Just one Horcrux. One. And that single act placed him at the very foundation of the darkest magical tradition ever practiced. The reason this matters isn't just historical curiosity. J.K. Rowling herself noted that wizards had almost certainly been attempting to create Horcruxes for centuries before Herpo succeeded, and the vast majority either died in the attempt or maimed themselves beyond recognition. She compared it to splitting the atom. The theoretical possibility existed long before anyone managed to do it without destroying themselves in the process. Herpo was the one who cracked it. That's the design philosophy behind the Horcrux as a concept. It wasn't born out of cleverness. It was born out of a willingness to do something so monstrous that everyone else stopped. Herpo simply didn't stop. 2. Ollivanders is established. 382 BC. The original Ollivander, ancestor of the Garrick Ollivander we meet in the books, set up his first wand stall in 382 BC, in what would eventually become Diagon Alley. The name itself is a tell. It derives from the words meaning, he who owns the olive wand, a clear Mediterranean signature, consistent with historians placing his origins in Roman times. Now, wand making had existed before this. The earliest wand makers were Celtic druids, who treated anything with a woody stem as a viable wand material and crafted accordingly. But there was a major problem with the ancient tradition. Customers brought their own cores. You'd show up, hand over your dragon heartstring or your unicorn hair, and the wand maker would do the rest. Ollivander looked at that process and called it what it was: inferior. His family's radical departure was simple but transformative. They took full control of the process. They sourced the core. They selected the wood. And most importantly, they established the principle that the wand chooses the wizard, not the other way around. A customer walking into Ollivanders wasn't picking a product. They were waiting to be chosen. That shift in philosophy, from consumer choice to magical compatibility, redefined the entire craft and set the standard that Garrick Ollivander was still following over 2,000 years later when Harry walked through his door. 3. The founding of Hogwarts, late 10th century. This one's easy to overlook because we take Hogwarts for granted. But there was a period in wizarding history when there was no Hogwarts. No houses, no sorting hat, no castle. And for the witches and wizards of the 10th century, that wasn't a minor inconvenience. It was genuinely dangerous. The 10th century was an era of active Muggle persecution of magical folk. Wizards and witches lived in constant fear of exposure. The decision to build a school at all was a courageous one, and the decision to hide it in the Scottish Highlands under layers of concealment enchantments powerful enough to make it invisible to Muggle eyes was a survival calculation, not an aesthetic preference. The 4 founders, Gryffindor, Hufflepuff, Ravenclaw, and Slytherin, pooled their respective expertise and their shared ambition to create what the Sorting Hat later described as a desire for the world's best magic school. The name, incidentally, came from Rowena Ravenclaw, who dreamed of a warty hog leading her to a cliff by a lake. Whether that was also how they chose the location remains a matter of speculation. The school's motto, Draco dormiens nunquam titilandus, never tickle a sleeping dragon, was emblazoned on the crest from day one, which tells you a lot about the founders' sense of humor. Hogwarts has now stood for over a millennium. Wars, rebellions, and at least 2 Wizarding World conflicts have come and gone. The castle is still standing. 4. Salazar Slytherin leaves Hogwarts and creates the Chamber of Secrets. Late 10th century. The founding of Hogwarts was supposed to be a story about unity. For a while, it was. 4 founders, 4 houses, 1 school. In theory, a meritocracy of magical ability regardless of blood status. Salazar Slytherin had other ideas. Slytherin's anti-Muggle rhetoric wasn't initially a deal-breaker for the other founders. His dark wizarding background wasn't either. What broke the relationship was his ultimatum. All 4 houses should only admit purebloods. Not just his own house. All of them. The others refused. Even Godric Gryffindor, his oldest ally among the 4, rejected him. And so, Slytherin left. But he didn't leave quietly. Deep beneath Hogwarts, accessible only through hidden pathways, Slytherin had constructed something that wouldn't be discovered for 1,000 years. The Chamber of Secrets. Inside it, a colossal statue of himself. And a basilisk. A creature he'd spent years perfecting. His intention was that one of his heirs would eventually return, access the chamber, and finish what he'd started, purging the school of Muggleborns. Think about that design philosophy for a second. Slytherin didn't just leave in anger. He engineered a long-game solution. A weapon with a 1,000-year delay, calibrated to activate only when someone with the right bloodline and the right intent came along. That's not a tantrum. That's patience as a form of violence. His plan was eventually realized by Tom Riddle in 1942, 1,000 years after the chamber was built. 5. The Deathly Hallows are created. Late 11th century. The 3 Peverell brothers, Antioch, Cadmus, and Ignotus, were born in the late 11th century. And according to the legend that has been passed down through every generation of wizarding children since, when they encountered death at a river crossing, they were each granted a gift. Antioch asked for the most powerful wand ever made. He got the Elder Wand. Cadmus asked to bring back the dead. He got the Resurrection Stone. Ignotus, the youngest and wisest, asked to walk away from death unseen. He got the Invisibility Cloak. Now, and I want to be clear about this, the story of death gifting these objects is almost certainly a myth. The more plausible reading is that the Peverell brothers were extraordinarily skilled wizards who created 3 objects of unparalleled magical power, and the folk legend of death's involvement was attached to them later. The Elder Wand, Resurrection Stone, and Invisibility Cloak are all real. Whether death made them is a different question entirely. What's not in dispute is their power. Together, they constitute the Deathly Hallows. And the one person in the entire history of the wizarding world who unified all 3 was Harry Potter himself. 6. The creation of Dementors. 15th century. Here's a name most Harry Potter fans have never heard. Acrisdus. He was a dark wizard of the 15th century. No one knows where he was born or who trained him. What we know is that at some point, he sailed out into the North Sea, stumbled upon a barren, unnamed island, and decided it was the perfect location to conduct dark magic experiments that were too extreme to carry out anywhere else. He began by placing concealment charms on the island, powerful enough that no one could find it intentionally. Then, he started luring Muggle sailors to its shores, torturing them, murdering them, systematically, over years. The records suggest that Acrisdus was already unstable before he arrived on the island. After years of isolation and increasingly extreme dark magic, he had lost his mind entirely. And it was during this period, whether intentionally or as an accidental byproduct of the magic he was practicing, that the first Dementors were created. It wasn't until Acrisdus died and his concealment charms faded that the island was finally discovered by the Ministry of Magic. They found the fortress. They found the Dementors. And rather than destroying them, because destroying them may not even be possible, the Ministry made a decision that still looks questionable by any reasonable standard. They kept the island, built a prison on it, and used the Dementors as guards. The prison was Azkaban. The civilian detail tends to get overlooked here. Think about the ordinary wizarding prison guards, the human ones, who were stationed at Azkaban in the early days before the full Dementor regime. What was the job description for that role? Work on an island in the North Sea, surrounded by soul-sucking creatures created by a mad dark wizard. Competitive salary. 7. The Goblin Rebellion of 1612. The relationship between witches, wizards, and goblins has never been comfortable. But 1612 is when it became openly violent. The rebellion broke out in or around Hogsmeade Village. Goblin forces occupied a local inn and used it as their base while systematically burning surrounding buildings. Casualties on both sides were high. high enough to still be taught in 5th year history of magic 4 centuries later. The reasons weren't hard to understand. Goblins ran the entire wizarding economy. They forged indestructible armor and the most powerful weapons in the world. Through Gringotts, they controlled every galleon that moved through wizarding Britain. And yet, they were barred from wands, excluded from the Wizengamot, and treated as second-class citizens by the very community that depended on them. Now, I know a lot of fans look at the Goblin Rebellion as a footnote, a bit of background color in the history of magic lessons that everyone falls asleep through. But I'd like to throw my hat into the ring and say that the 1612 Rebellion is one of the most important events in pre-Harry wizarding history, and not for the reasons you'd expect, because the rebellion failed, and the consequence of its failure was worse than if it had never happened at all. Within 2 decades, the Wizards' Council had passed the Code of Wand Use, formally making it illegal for goblins to possess wands. What had previously been an informal exclusion became statute law. The rebellion that was meant to win goblins equal rights instead created the legal architecture for their permanent subjugation. The pattern, marginalized group pushes back, the backlash codifies the oppression, is one of the darkest through lines in wizarding history. And it explains a lot about why Griphook, 4 centuries later, still doesn't trust a single wizard he's ever met. 8. Tom Riddle and the Road to the First Wizarding War, 1938 to 1970. Tom Riddle arrived at Hogwarts in 1938, an 11-year-old orphan from Wool's Orphanage in London, who had already been performing unexplained, involuntary magic for years. Dumbledore, who introduced him to the wizarding world personally, was the only person who saw him clearly from the start. Everyone else saw a charming, brilliant student. By 1939, Riddle had assembled a gang of fellow Slytherins, described by Dumbledore as a mixture of the weak seeking protection, the ambitious seeking glory, and the thuggish seeking a leader who could show them more refined cruelty. They called themselves the Knights of Walpurgis. It would not be the last name they went by. In 1942, Riddle killed Moaning Myrtle and used her death to create his first Horcrux, his diary. The following year, he killed his Muggle father in Little Hangleton and created his second. He was 16 years old. He graduated in 1945, applied immediately for the Defense Against the Dark Arts position at Hogwarts. Dumbledore blocked the appointment. Riddle took a job at Borgin & Burke's, spent years cultivating a fake friendship with an antiques collector named Hepzibah Smith, stole Hufflepuff's cup and Slytherin's locket, poisoned her, framed her house elf, created his 4th and 5th Horcruxes, and then disappeared for nearly a decade. When Voldemort resurfaced in 1971, the Knights of Walpurgis had become the Death Eaters. He had a fully formed ideology, a loyal following, and a clear target: the Ministry of Magic, the wizarding establishment, and every Muggle-born witch and wizard in Britain. The First Wizarding War had begun. 9. The First Wizarding War, 1971 to 1981. The First Wizarding War lasted 11 years. To put that in perspective, the Second Wizarding War, the one the books are actually about, lasted 3. The First War was longer, bloodier, and arguably more terrifying, because nobody knew who was fighting on which side. Voldemort's use of the Imperius Curse meant that trusted colleagues could be unwitting agents. Death Eaters kept their identities concealed. The Dark Mark appearing over a murder scene was specifically designed to maximize psychological terror rather than simply announce a death. Ministry of Magic in disarray, marriages rushed, families hiding. In response, Dumbledore formed the Order of the Phoenix in 1971, a covert counterinsurgency operation that operated outside official ministry channels, precisely because the ministry could no longer be fully trusted. Members included Moody, the Longbottoms, the Pruitt brothers, Hagrid, and eventually James Potter, Lily Evans, Sirius Black, and Remus Lupin. The war entered its most desperate phase around 1980. Order members were being killed systematically. McKinnon, Bones, the Pruitts. Barty Crouch Sr. finally authorized Aurors to use unforgivable curses in the field. The ministry was fighting back, but Voldemort himself remained untouchable. And then, in 1980, 2 boys were born. Harry Potter on July 31st, Neville Longbottom on July 30th. 10. The Prophecy and the Night It All Ended, 1980 to 1981. The prophecy was overheard accidentally. Sybil Trelawney was being interviewed for a teaching post at Hogwarts, in a private room at the Hog's Head pub in Hogsmeade. Dumbledore was unimpressed. Then, Trelawney entered a trance and spoke. A boy would be born at the end of July to parents who had defied Voldemort 3 times. This boy would have power the Dark Lord did not know, and either must die at the hand of the other, for neither can live while the other survives. Severus Snape was listening at the door. He heard enough to report back to Voldemort, but not enough to have caught the full prophecy. He missed the critical detail that Voldemort would mark the boy as his equal, that the power Voldemort didn't know was love. He passed on a fragment, and that fragment was enough for Voldemort to decide it was Harry Potter. The Potters went into hiding. Fidelius Charm, Secret Keeper, initially Sirius Black, then Peter Pettigrew. A switch made in secret because they feared Sirius was the more obvious target. Pettigrew betrayed them. Voldemort arrived at Godric's Hollow on October 31st, 1981. James died first. Then Lily refused to step aside. Voldemort had offered to spare her at Snape's request, and she refused. Her death for her son's life created a protection Voldemort had no framework to understand. When the killing curse hit Harry, it rebounded. Voldemort's body was destroyed. His soul fragment fled to Albania, unable to die fully because his Horcruxes still existed. The First Wizarding War ended that night. Harry Potter was 11 months old. The wizarding world celebrated as if it was over. Millicent Bagnold, the minister at the time, described the widespread public revelry as the community's inalienable right to party. Fireworks over Muggle villages. Celebrations that nearly broke the international statute of wizarding secrecy in a dozen places. But it wasn't over. The Death Eaters who escaped Azkaban, and there were many, were still out there. Bellatrix Lestrange, dragged into the courtroom after torturing the Longbottoms into insanity, screamed that the Dark Lord would return for her. She was right. And that's it. Everything that happened before Harry Potter even opened his eyes in that cupboard under the stairs. If you want to know what came next, here's every major event after the Deathly Hallows.